And now we are joined by the former Marine Corps Intelligence Officer, Weapons Inspector, Officer and Gentleman, the one and only Scott Ritter. Scott, welcome back to the show. Let's start, if you'll permit me, you're welcome to say no, but let's start with some recent controversy regarding the nature of your ongoing commentary, which is ceaseless. It's every day, every hour, and many millions wait upon it, including me. As it happens, I really like you, and I've worked with you for 25 years and more. But whether I liked you or not, I would certainly want to hear what you had to say. And that's essentially what I'm telling people who are not happy with some of the lines that you're taking, some of the notes that you are sounding. I mean, I often see Bob Dylan's album behind you. I'm a Bob Dylan fanatic. I don't like Bob Dylan's politics. Indeed, I go to considerable length not to know what exactly they are, because I don't need to like his politics to admire his art. Ditto, you don't need to like everything Scott Ritter believes, but you'd be a fool not to listen to him. That's how I see it. Tell me how you're reacting to the recent controversies.
First of all, George, I like you very much, and I do care about your opinion. I count you as a friend, and I'm always alert to my friends. But to be frank, most of the opinions on the social media platforms, I really don't give two hoots about, because these are for people who are anonymous. It's very difficult to take anybody seriously when you don't know who they are, what their background is, and B, frankly, their arguments are grounded in fundamental ignorance. I've been in the promoting peace business for a long time, as you know. But, when you promote peace, you can't do it in a kumbaya, hold hands, and everything's wonderful environment. You have to deal with peace in the reality of the situation. On a number of occasions, I prevented war from breaking out between the United States and Iraq while I was a weapons inspector, because I held the Iraqis accountable for the letter of the law. I didn't allow them to live in a fantasy world where they could think that because it was unfair, they could somehow do things that the law didn't allow them to do. I made sure they understood that the only way forward out of this situation we found ourselves in was for total adherence to the mandate set down by the Security Council of the United Nations in a Chapter 7 resolution. It's called international law. Now, a lot of people are poo-pooing that concept. You can't. You're not a serious person if you don't understand that international law is the framework around which any agreements will be made. Just because the United States doesn't adhere to international law doesn't mean that it doesn't apply, especially in this case, if you're a nation like Iran that has signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. I want to remind people they are a signatory to that. It is binding to them by law. And not only that, but they've agreed to the safeguards agreements and other aspects of monitoring and verification. And more importantly, Iran has decided that it will continue to be a member in good standing of the NPT, which means they will not pursue a nuclear weapon. I just want to say that again for all the people out there who think that the world would be a better place if Iran just built a nuclear bomb. You can't be more Iranian than the Iranians. And the quickest way to guarantee a war is for Iran to pursue a nuclear weapons program in violation of its commitments under the NPT. That's for sure. So I've been trying to hold people's feet to the fire about the facts of the situation. That if we're going to look at a path out of this, it's going to have to be through negotiations that take into account the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and Iran's commitments not to have a nuclear weapon. No matter how unfair people might think that is, I want to remind people that it is the official policy of the Iranian government not to pursue a nuclear bomb. So why anybody out there, anonymous people in social media, feel that they can somehow override the prerogative of the Iranian government and say, no, the only way forward is for Iran to develop a nuclear bomb, which is the equivalent of the Israeli bomb, etc. It's not a serious argument. And the other thing I need to point out is you have to deal with reality. For instance, when we sat down with the Iraqis in the spring of 1992, after they had lied to us, submitted false declarations, etc., and told them that they have no choice but to tell the truth, that the only path forward out of this that doesn't result in American bombs landing on them is for them to tell the truth. They told the truth. And the same thing, every time I confronted the Iraqis about the need to prevent a conflict, I said, you have to assiduously adhere to the commitments you made. And it didn't hurt for me to remind them of what was happening, to count the aircraft carriers, to count the aircraft wings, to count the troops, the cruise missiles that were amassing on their border, because that is the real potential of conflict that will be brought to bear. So people get upset with me when I point out, not that I'm applauding it, but when I say, hey, 7 B-2 bombers have been deployed from Whitman Air Force Base in the United States to Diego Garcia. This is an unprecedented deployment. They are matched with 10 KC-135R tankers. That's what's needed to launch airstrikes against a target like Iran. That this is something that should wake people up, because there is a real potential of conflict. I'm not promoting the conflict. I'm not encouraging the conflict. I'm simply stating the straight up fact, and whether the people out there who are bruised by what I have to say are insulted or not, I don't care. You can't undo reality. And the reality is there are B-2 bombers, there are Ohio-class submarines, there are nuclear weapons attached to each one of these weapon systems, nuclear weapons that have been designed and built for the sole purpose of attacking targets like those that exist in Iran. Again, I'm not promoting it. I'm not saying that I encourage this. I'm stating the fact that the Trump administration has a nuclear posture attached to a nuclear employment plan that will use low-yield nuclear weapons in a conflict against Iran, and we can't pretend that that doesn't exist when we talk about how we get out of this. So forgive me if I tell my Iranian friends, and many of them are, I had a nice exchange with Mr. Marandi. We are in disagreement, but I basically have said, don't seek conflict with America, because it will be devastating to you. It may be devastating to America as well. But my goal here, if America wants to stick its hand into a bee's nest and get stung, that's its business. But I don't want America to go to war against Iran. I'm trying to avoid a war with Iran. And so I'm pointing out the reality that there's military might assembled, and maybe the best way forward is for Iran to do what Iran claims it wants to do, not have a nuclear bomb. And maybe the best way to do that is to dismantle a nuclear infrastructure that no longer has any reason to exist. You know, the Iranians just signed a strategic framework agreement with the Russians where they recognize that they are unable to build the nuclear power plants that they thought they were going to be able to build. So they are turning that over to the Russians. The Russians will now build Iran's nuclear power plants, and the Russians will provide the fuel for these nuclear power plants. So Iran's need to have a massive uranium enrichment program is no longer justified by the facts on the ground in terms of peaceful nuclear energy. So one must ask yourself, why is Iran retaining this advanced uranium enrichment capability when there is no legitimate civilian purpose for it anymore? And maybe Iran would be wise to negotiate that away for a normalization of relations, lifting of economic sanctions, and most importantly, the avoidance of conflict. If this is controversial, George, so be it.
Well, we may come back to the Iranian front, but first of all, I want to take your expert analysis of what's being called Signal Gate. I call it the Yemeni bombers affair. It started out as a farce. It may have ended for the Yemenis as a tragedy. It turns out that Mike Waltz, in what might be the alibi for every adulterer in the world, I don't know how her number got in there. It just got sucked in, is what he said. Whether or not it got sucked in, or he got sucked in, or how it happened, there was a pro-Israel journalist, editor, the most pro-Israel editor in America, sitting in a group with the top leaders of the United States as they, in real time, brought the house down on top of scores of now dead innocent Yemenis. What's it all about, Scott?
Well, let me start by saying something, because I now I recall my wife sent me a posting that you had out there that started off with, there's a lot of controversy around Scott. And she immediately called me, "What have you done to piss George Galloway off?" I said, "I don't know. I mean, I don't know what I've done." And she said, "Well, you have to watch this." So I watched it, and I know that you took umbrage, for instance, over the Mutla Ridge massacre, the Highway of Death massacre, and things that I've said about that. Look, I'm unapologetic. I'm a Marine, and my business was death. And war is about death. And this is why I'm so committed to prevent war, because I know what happens when you go to war. And I know, for instance, when an Iraqi column leaves Kuwait City after raping the city, pillaging the city, full of the security services that are have cars loaded up with stolen goods, that there was bloodlust in the air. And we killed the lead vehicles, we killed the rear vehicles, and we killed everything in between. Now, a lot of people escaped, but it was a bloodbath. And I'm unapologetic about it. That's war. I'm also somebody who said that I wish we had finished the job, gone on to fight for another 36 hours, and killed 30,000 of Saddam Hussein's Republican Guard, because then Saddam wouldn't have had a Republican Guard to prop him up and continue for another decade. Our stated objective at the beginning of the war was to destroy the Republican Guard, and we failed to do that for political reasons, not military reasons. I'm unapologetic about that, because this is what war is. If you don't want to go to war, if you don't want to have killers like me out there doing this job, then for God's sake, don't go to war, which is why today I'm trying to prevent a war. But I'm also somebody who takes umbrage at people who call what I and others do in times of conflict war crimes inherently. People die in war. It's a horrible business. Again, why I advocate so strongly against it. War crimes, read international humanitarian law, read the Geneva Conventions. When we talk about striking targets, there's a thing that we call proportionality and military necessity. These are two things that have to be discussed by the military before going in. What are, is the use of force that you're applying to a target proportional to the threat that you're trying to do? And is there military necessity attached to that? Meaning that in war, you are allowed to kill civilians. People pretend that you're not. No, you're allowed to kill civilians. And there's no set number or percentage. It's all linked to military necessity. If there is a military necessity to hit the target and you can justify the collateral damage, then you strike it. And it's almost impossible for any court of jurisdiction to hold you accountable for that if you go through the procedures. So I didn't spend too much time reflecting on the civilian losses attached to taking this building down, because I took at face value the notion that the Houthis' top missile man was in the building, and somebody made a decision about military necessity. His girlfriend was there. She probably died, and any civilians in that building probably died. Because I'm against war, my heart bleeds for these people. I wish we weren't involved in this conflict, but I can't get spun up like other people do, because I've been in that seat. I've ordered bombs to be dropped on targets where civilians were killed. That is just the harsh reality of war. I wish it wasn't happening. But so I focus mainly on the security aspects of this. And, I can't comment why a former Israeli prison guard was present in this chat room. Goldberg is not a trusted resource. We know, George, you and I know the reporting he did in the lead up to the Iraq war, the lies he told linking Iraq to Al Qaeda. The man is an inveterate liar. He's a manufacturer, a fabricator. He's not a journalist. He should not have been there. And I am inclined not to believe anything he writes until I saw the texts. And I would tell you, as a military man, that was a war plan. It wasn't a formal war plan, but when you provide information such as the launch times of specific weapon systems, time over target of specific weapon systems, when you describe a target in very specific terms to include things such as visual confirmation. That gets into sources and methods that violates security protocols. This was a conversation that should not have taken place on an unclassified server. And I will also say this. During the Gulf War, George, I was involved in the targeting of the Adamiyah bomb shelter. You know that story, the horrible story. Hundreds of Iraqi civilians were killed in that, innocent civilians, people who thought they were safe in a bomb shelter, and we dropped 2,000-pound bombs on it, and we blew it up, and they died horrible deaths. I will tell you that when the information came in on CNN that what had happened, there was no fist bumping. There was actually several people got up from their desks and ran to the bathroom and threw up. Other people had to excuse themselves and go out and cry, because this isn't what American military men are supposed to do. We're not supposed to be in the business of killing civilians. And I can guarantee you that everybody in that headquarters building that was associated with that target was sick to their stomach about that. So when you see American officials, they fist bumping, high fiving, and flaming when civilians are dying, this is not a good sign of the mental health of the people that are planning this war. Civilians die in war, George. It's horrible. And every civilian death should be mourned, whether you can justify it under the law of war or not. I know I shed a tear when the Adamia bomb shelter was hit. Everybody did. And I know that when I give you another target, I was tasked with killing Saddam Hussein. We had specific intelligence about his movements. My job was to take that intelligence and match it to targets. And I developed several targets over the course of several days. They were turned over to American aircraft, and we struck those homes. These were homes, civilian homes that we were told Saddam was going to be staying in. Well, he wasn't there. The families were, and we killed these families. And later I went back as a weapons inspector. I made sure I drove by those places, and I stopped my car, and I got out, and I said a prayer for the people that died in there, because it sickened me that they had to die in a conflict, and that I was responsible for their deaths. That's how a moral person behaves, takes responsibility for their actions, and never, ever cheers on the deaths of innocent civilians, even in a time of war, especially in a time of war. And the high-fiving, this cavalier approach towards civilian death is sickening to me, and I think it's reflective of an illness that exists in not just the Trump administration, but I would say in the United States government today. We don't have people who are sickened by the concepts of war, who are disturbed. I don't know how many times I had to ask General Waller, 4-star General number 2, to General Schwarzkopf, is what we're doing right? Do I have legal authority to do this? Are we certain you want me to do this? Do you really want me to turn over these targets? Have we run this through a lawyer? Is this the right thing to do? I asked these questions repeatedly, and I was just a junior captain. And I just would hope that would be how anybody would respond to something like this, to make sure that before you drop the bomb on the target, that you've asked the question, are you 100% certain that this is the right thing to do, that we're striking the right target? Have you gone through the potential collateral consequences of this action? Can we justify the civilian deaths that are going to happen? And you saw by the high-fiving and the fist bumping that was done, they're not asking these questions. They're glorifying this death. They're treating these civilian casualties as a nothing burger, and that's just fundamentally wrong. And that, to me, the cavalier approach to security and the fundamental disregard for civilian life are the two things that emerge from Signalgate.
Is that scandal going to run and run? Will it bring anybody down?
I don't know. One of the problems is that Washington, D.C. is so politicized today, so polarized and on a partisan camp, that any effort to bring Pete Hegseth and other Mike Waltz to hold them accountable will immediately run into a wall that says, well, you're just trying to bring down the Trump administration. I would like to believe that we could be in a situation where our elected representatives would do the right thing and hold these men accountable. What they've done is wrong. If I had done this, if I had gone out on a Signal platform and had this kind of chat, I would have been fired and I would have been charged with serious violations of the law. These men broke the law. Now they're going to try and hide it, disguise it, but you can't disguise what they did. And I think as Richard Nixon learned in Watergate, the biggest crime was the cover-up. If you had just admitted it, if Pete had just come out and said, yeah, I screwed up. If Waltz had come out and said, yep, bad move on my part, and I'm submitting my resignation to the president. And if the president turned around and said, yeah, Mike, hold up. We're going to learn from this. I'm going to keep you on, but let's not do this again. I think this problem would have gone away. But, the biggest crime is the cover-up. And right now you have people trying to pretend that something bad didn't happen when everybody reading that text who knows. There's not a military professional in the world that doesn't read that text. And again, I got in trouble online because somebody said, Scott, you shouldn't be connecting the dots the way that you're doing because you're not, helping the administration out. I said, well, my job is to help the administration. I'm not here to give away classified secrets. But the truth is the ultimate weapon. And, when you connect the dot, it's clear to any professional what happened and the damage that was done by this. The Houthi will based upon that text, I can guarantee you they will deconstruct this, reverse engineer it, and they will make it almost impossible for America to target high-value targets in real time, because the Houthi now have timelines associated with every aspect of our strike package. And so they will just adjust their patterns of life accordingly to ensure that they're never where we think they are.
Finally, and I'm always grateful for your time, Scott, you're very generous with it to us. The talks in Riyadh, they seem to have lasted a long time. They labored mightily. Did they bring forth any more than a mouse of a Black Sea ceasefire against ships that weren't being fired upon anywhere? What's your take on the current state of bringing the Ukraine war to an end?
Well, I'm not going to diminish what they accomplished, because this was always going to be a, crawl, walk, run process. We were never going to sprint to the finish line. There was always going to have to be confidence building measures brought in, not just in terms of Russia's confidence in Ukraine's ability to adhere, and Ukraine's confidence in Russia, but Russia's confidence in America to hold Ukraine accountable, to hold Ukraine's feet to the fire. And so I think these are two very important things, because there's the 30-day moratorium that's backdated to March 18th on striking energy targets. That was violated early on, but now America is apparently going to hold Ukraine's feet to the fire on this. And this is an important test of America's will and ability to hold Ukraine. But there are other things talked about in that meeting that aren't being discussed, but we're getting hints of it. For instance, I think the United States has conceded to Russia the reality of Russia's territorial demands. And the United States is now working to get Ukraine to accept the inevitability of the fact that they have lost the 5 territories permanently. Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk, together with Crimea, will never again be Ukrainian. It will always be part of Russia, and the United States is going to lead the charge to get international recognition of that. And we also see through the Black Sea agreement, there are some very important measures taking place. For instance, getting Russian banks linked up to SWIFT. This is a precursor for when the sanctions come down. This is beginning the process of bringing Russia back. So this isn't just a throwaway agreement. This is an agreement that begins to build the basic building blocks of what's going to be needed when the war stops and Russia is going to reintegrate with the West. And these are important first steps. So there's a lot of important. And then the other thing is just the body language and the tone of the Russians. Very relaxed, very confident. And they aren't normally this way. And so what I'm reading in this is that the Russians are very satisfied with the way these negotiations are going. Now, if you go on X, of course, there's a whole community of people who condemn Vladimir Putin for being weak and soft and caving in, and that you can't trust America, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But thank goodness we have a Russian government that deals with reality. And I think the reality is that the United States is serious about peace and is working seriously with the Russians to achieve that peace. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But the first thing is to make sure that you have the foundations of a peace. And key to that is making sure that the Russians get what the Russians are demanding, because they are the victors. They are also the righteous party in this. They're the wronged party. They're the ones who have been attacked. They're the ones who have had their people assaulted. And if the Russians feel comfortable with the direction that this is going, then I think that we will have a successful peace. So at the end of the day, Ukraine just doesn't get a vote. The United States will lay down the law, and Ukraine will have to do what the United States tells them to do. But we have to make sure that before we lay down the law with Ukraine, that we're on solid ground with the Russians. And I think we are.
You know, the Nord Stream pipeline looks set to be repaired and reopened as a Russian-American venture, through which presumably the Europeans will again be forced by the United States to take Russian gas. We both believe, I think, that America under Joe Biden actually destroyed the pipeline or caused it to be destroyed. That's going to take some explaining away. I'm a little surprised that Trump is not driving home the extent to which the Biden administration are hugely culpable for great crimes that cost many lives, perhaps 1 million lives, and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars, and motivated by their own personal corruption. Will Trump ever turn to that, or has he decided to just let old Joe shuffle off this mortal coil in due course?
I can't speak for the Trump administration, even though many people on social media believe that somehow I've been co-opted by them or corrupted by them or somehow owned and operated by them. But no, I'm just me, and I can't speak on their behalf or for them. I don't know what their thinking is, except to say that my observation is that Donald Trump is a very vindictive, thin-skinned, narcissistic man who holds a grudge, and that he's not going to let Joe Biden off the hook. But we are in a very delicate stage of negotiations with the Russians, where it's imperative that we don't tell the Russians everything that we did to be involved in this war, because our sins are many and they're mighty. And I think it's in Donald Trump's best interest at this point in time to de-emphasize the role that the CIA played. Now, remember, there's a reason why we had 20 bases in Ukraine, CIA bases. They weren't there to hold hands and sing Kumbaya or to promote, the general welfare of the international community. They were there to spy on Russia and to commit crimes and atrocities against Russians. And the CIA hasn't yet stood down, as far as I know. So the Trump administration is treading on some very thin ice right now, and I think it's in their best interest to suppress any major digging into what really happened during the Biden administration until we get a finished peace deal, until we begin improving relations with Russia. And then at some point in time, maybe 2 years down the road, 3 years down the road, I think definitely before he leaves office, we'll start to get, the revelation of, just how bad Joe Biden was. But I think if Trump can contrast the sins of the Biden administration with the salvation provided by Donald Trump, that even has greater political value for this man.
Yeah, you've got the makings of a politician. Scott Ritter, always a pleasure and an education talking to you. Thanks very much for joining us.